A white mother threw her dark-skinned twins in the trash, thinking she had gotten rid of them forever. Years later, they returned to the city as millionaires. What did they do when they found their mother? Watch until the end. Subscribe and write where you're watching from, and don't forget to share this video. Hannah had always feared the whispers of her small, stiff-necked town, the way rumors moved like dust along the cracked sidewalks, catching in the air with every sigh of wind. She had grown up under the stern eye of her mother, who kept the windows clean and the curtains pulled back so neighbors could see how upright the family remained, even when Hannah's father drank himself into silence in the evenings. The neighbors saw everything in this town, and they judged everything with tight lips and shaken heads. Hannah felt those invisible eyes even as she walked to the local clinic on that heavy, humid morning, clutching her belly with hands that trembled in the June heat. Her mother had not gone with her. She had only stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms folded, eyes cold as glass, and told Hannah she had shamed them all. The pregnancy was not a secret anymore. The swelling was impossible to hide, and the neighbors had begun to notice. They would murmur behind her back at the market, eyes darting from her face to the curve of her belly, quick flickers of judgment that left Hannah wishing she could disappear into the dry ground. She did not know why she was so afraid. She told herself it was just a child, just a part of her, that she would find a way to carry it, to mother it, and perhaps in that act she would find the worth her mother had never given her. But fear is not logical, and shame is a poison that seeps into the skin, into the bones, until it feels as if there is no escape from it. On the day her water broke, Hannah thought she would drown in that shame, her body betraying her as she bit her lip to keep from crying out. Her hands pressed against the wall as another wave of pain clutched her from the inside. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed above as Hannah was led down the narrow corridor, sweat running down her back, fear thick in her mouth. The nurse's eyes were indifferent, glancing at the chart and the clock, muttering about young girls who didn't know better. Hannah lay on the hard bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a blur of pain and the sharp, bright knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The cries came quickly, shrill and sharp, cutting through the silence of the sterile room. Hannah turned her head, breathless, waiting for the nurse to place the babies in her arms, to see the faces of her daughters for the first time. But when the nurse looked at the babies, her expression shifted, her lips pressing together in a tight, thin line. She exchanged a look with the doctor, who coughed and adjusted his glasses, before finally turning to Hannah with a look she would never forget, a look of discomfort, of pity and confusion. The baby's skin was dark, rich, deep brown, beautiful in its softness, but to Hannah it was a nightmare unfolding before her. Her mind recoiled, searching for explanations that did not come, for reasons that did not exist, and in that moment the room seemed to spin, the lights harsh and cold. She could not hear the cries of her daughters, only the loud pounding of her own heart, and the whispers that she knew would rise like smoke in the town when they found out. The nurses cleaned the babies, wrapped them in thin, white hospital blankets, and placed them in the bassinet. Hannah could not look at them, could not force her eyes to turn toward the small, innocent faces that held none of the shame she felt. The mother she wished to be died in that room, replaced by a fear that sank its claws into her chest, twisting and tearing until she could barely breathe. Days passed, but Hannah could not bring herself to touch them. Her mother came to the hospital once, stood by the window, arms folded, eyes cold as ice, and said nothing. Her father did not come at all. The nurses fed the babies, changed them, held them while Hannah turned her face to the wall, unable to confront what had become of her, what the town would say, what she saw every time she closed her eyes. The shame grew inside her like a sickness, rotting away the small, tender hopes she had once held for herself and her children. The whispers began even before she left the hospital. She heard them in the hallway, the quick, sharp voices of nurses who thought they were out of earshot, speaking of shame, of disgrace, of a girl who could not even be trusted with her own skin. Hannah began to see her daughters as a curse, as a mark upon her that she could not wash away, a permanent stain that would follow her through the streets of her town, growing darker with every step she took. One night, unable to sleep, she sat up in the narrow hospital bed, staring at the window, where the moon hung low and bright in the sky. The cries of the babies echoed softly from the corner of the room, a reminder of what she could not face. She pressed her hands against her ears, rocking slightly, tears running down her face as the weight of her fear crushed her. The thought came to her quietly at first, like a shadow, then louder, clearer, until it was the only thing she could hear. They would never let her live in peace. She would never escape the shame. She would never be free. In the early hours before dawn, Hannah dressed in silence, pulling on her clothes with shaking hands. The hospital was quiet, the halls empty, except for the occasional flicker of light from a passing nurse's station. She moved like a ghost, her footsteps soft, almost invisible, as she made her way to the nursery. The nurse on duty had dozed off in her chair, a magazine resting open on her lap, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the floor. Hannah stepped into the nursery, her breath catching as she saw them lying there, so small, so fragile, wrapped in their blankets, sleeping peacefully. For a moment, she felt something crack inside her, a softness, a pull that made her reach out with trembling fingers to touch the edge of the blanket. One of the babies stirred, a small sigh escaping her lips, her tiny hand curling around Hannah's finger. The warmth of that touch burned through Hannah like a knife, cutting deep, awakening something that was quickly drowned by the wave of fear and shame crashing over her. She pulled her hand back, biting down on her lip to keep from crying out. She glanced back at the nurse, who remained asleep, oblivious. Quickly, before she could change her mind, Hannah lifted the babies, holding them close to her chest, feeling the weight of them, the soft rise and fall of their breathing, the small sounds they made as they shifted in their sleep. She moved through the hospital like a shadow, slipping out the side door into the cold, damp air of the morning. The sky was heavy with clouds, the promise of rain hanging in the air, the world hushed and waiting. Hannah walked quickly, her eyes darting around, clutching the babies to her chest as if they were a burden she could not bear, but could not yet let go. The streets were empty, the houses dark, the town still sleeping as she made her way to the outskirts, to the old industrial area where the buildings stood abandoned, broken windows like blind eyes staring into the darkness. She found the dumpster behind a crumbling warehouse, the metal lid rusted, the smell rising up to meet her as she approached. Her breath came in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the babies who had begun to stir, their tiny faces scrunching, soft cries breaking the silence of the dawn. Hannah closed her eyes, her body shaking, her mind screaming at her to stop, to turn back, to hold them and find another way, but the fear was stronger, the shame deeper, and it swallowed her whole. With a sob that tore through her, she lifted the lid of the dumpster and placed the babies inside, their cries rising, sharp and desperate as she stepped back. She slammed the lid shut, pressing her hands against it, her head bowed, her tears falling onto the cold metal. For a moment, she stood there, her heart pounding, the cries echoing in her ears before she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the wet pavement, her breath ragged in the cold air. She did not look back, could not look back, as the sky opened above her and the rain began to fall, washing the streets clean, erasing the last traces of her daughters from the world. She told herself she was free now. She told herself it was over. She told herself she could go back to her life, to the quiet, to the safety of being unseen, unnoticed, unjudged. She told herself many things as she walked away from that place, the rain soaking her hair, her clothes, the cold sinking into her bones. But as she boarded the bus that would take her away, back towards the city, toward the life she thought she could reclaim, a small voice deep inside her whispered that she would never be free, that some stains could never be washed away, that some cries could never be unheard. Behind her, in the darkness, the cries of the babies rose into the rain-soaked morning, their small voices calling out into a world that had turned its back on them, alone in the cold, waiting for someone to come. And somewhere, not far away, a pair of tired, calloused hands tightened around the handle of a cart, as a man who had lost everything moved through the rain, searching for scraps, for something to fill the empty places in his life, not knowing that soon he would find something that would change everything. Rain fell softly against the cracked pavement as Raymond pushed his squeaking cart along the narrow alley behind the abandoned warehouses. The dawn was gray, clouds hanging low and heavy, promising another day of dampness that would cling to his clothes and sink into his bones as he searched for cans, wires, and scraps to sell. The world was quiet except for the soft patter of rain and the distant bark of a stray dog echoing against the cold brick walls. He pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around himself, his hands rough and darkened with years of labor, his feet sliding slightly on the wet concrete as he maneuvered around puddles that reflected the shifting clouds above. The smell of rotting food and damp cardboard grew stronger as he neared the dumpsters lined up like silent sentinels against the side of the building. Raymond had been coming here for years, digging through what others had thrown away, collecting the small treasures that would buy him a meal or a few coins to save for the days when even trash would not give him enough. Each morning, he followed the same routine, checking each bin with practiced movements, his mind quiet as he worked, remembering the days when he had a family, a small home, and laughter that filled the rooms. Those days were gone, taken in a moment by a drunk driver on a rainy night, leaving him with nothing but grief that settled deep into his chest and a silence that became his constant companion. As he lifted the lid of one rusted dumpster, a sound broke the rhythm of his morning. It was faint at first, a soft cry that barely rose above the sound of the rain, but it froze him in place, his hand gripping the edge of the cold metal, breath catching in his throat. He leaned closer, listening, the world narrowing down to the soft, desperate sounds coming from within the darkness of the bin. Carefully, he adjusted the cart and set it aside, using both hands to lift the heavy lid fully, the rusted hinges groaning in protest as it opened. Inside, wrapped in thin, damp hospital blankets, lay two tiny babies, their skin dark and glistening with rain, their faces twisted in cries that shook their small bodies. Raymond's heart clenched, the memory of his own lost child flashing through his mind, the small coffin, the weight of his wife's hand in his as they lowered it into the ground, the emptiness that had followed him like a shadow since that day. His eyes filled with tears he could not remember allowing himself to shed for years. The sight of these abandoned children tearing through the hard shell he had built around his grief. He reached in with trembling hands, lifting one baby first, then the other, holding them close to his chest, feeling the fragile warmth of their bodies against his skin. They were so light, so small, their cries muffled against the fabric of his jacket as he tucked them inside to protect them from the cold rain. He could feel their tiny hearts beating rapidly, could hear their ragged breaths, and for a moment the alley around him disappeared, leaving only the weight of these lives in his arms. Raymond looked around, but the alley was empty, the world indifferent to the suffering it had left in a dumpster. He adjusted the babies, shifting them carefully, and began to walk, pushing his cart with one hand while the other cradled the bundles beneath his coat. The rain soaked through the fabric, dripping down his neck, but he did not care. Each step was slow and careful as he made his way back towards the small, broken building he called home, the abandoned shed at the edge of the scrapyard where he slept each night on a mattress made from rags and old blankets. Inside, it was dark and smelled of rust and dampness, the air heavy with the cold that never seemed to leave. Raymond set the babies down on the makeshift bed, lighting a small lamp with shaking hands, the flickering light casting long shadows on the cracked walls. He peeled back the wet blankets, inspecting the babies, checking their limbs and faces, noting the hunger in their cries, the way their mouths opened wide in search of comfort that had been denied them. His heart ached, but it also stirred with a sense of purpose he had not felt since before the accident, before the world had taken everything from him. He found an old bottle, rinsed it as best as he could, and filled it with warm water from the kettle he had boiled over a small fire, mixing in a small amount of powdered milk he kept for his tea. He fed the babies carefully, one after the other, their tiny mouths struggling to grasp the nipple, the milk dribbling down their chins as they drank with desperate hunger. Their cries softened, turning to soft whimpers, then to the quiet, rhythmic breaths of exhausted infants. He wiped their faces with a clean piece of cloth, wrapping them again in blankets, adding layers of old shirts and pieces of fabric to keep them warm. As they slept, Raymond sat beside them, watching the rise and fall of their chests, the way their tiny fingers curled into fists, the small, almost imperceptible movements they made as they dreamed. He remembered the way his son had looked when he was this small, the quiet mornings when his wife would sing softly as she held him, the smell of milk and soap, and the warmth of their home. The pain was sharp, but as he looked at the babies, the sharpness faded, leaving behind a quiet ache that felt almost like hope. He knew the world would judge him for taking in these children, that people would question his motives, would look at his ragged clothes and rough hands and see only a broken man unworthy of the trust that had been forced upon him. But Raymond did not care. These babies needed him, and he needed them. They were a chance to hold something good again, to protect life instead of watching it slip away. In the days that followed, Raymond's routine changed. No longer did he roam the streets with his cart for hours, searching for scraps to sell. Instead, he woke early to care for the babies, feeding them, changing them, washing their tiny bodies with water warmed over the fire. He wrapped them close to his chest as he worked, pushing the cart with one hand while the other cradled their small forms, singing softly to them as he picked through trash for bottles and wires to sell. Neighbors watched with suspicion, their eyes following him as he moved through the alleys, some whispering about the old, crazy man who had stolen babies, others shaking their heads, pitying the children for the life they would face. Raymond ignored them, focusing on the needs of the babies, on the soft sounds they made when they slept. On the way, they reached for him with tiny hands that clung to his shirt, their grip stronger than their size suggested. At night, as the city quieted and the cold crept back into the shed, Raymond lay beside the babies, his body curled protectively around them, the small warmth of their presence easing the loneliness that had haunted him for so long. He prayed quietly, asking for strength, for guidance, for the chance to give these children a life better than the one they had been left to face. Each morning, he woke with a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the responsibility that had fallen into his hands, by the love that was slowly filling the empty spaces within him. There were challenges he could not have anticipated. The babies fell sick with fevers that burned through their small bodies, their cries piercing the nights, leaving him desperate and afraid. He begged for medicine from clinics, offering to work for the doctors, cleaning floors, carrying supplies, anything to pay for what the babies needed. Some days he went without food so they could have what they needed, his stomach empty but his spirit firm. As weeks turned into months, Raymond named the babies Amara and Aoife, names that meant grace and love, gifts he hoped they would carry with them as they grew. He taught himself to care for them as best as he could, learning to recognize their cries, to understand their needs, to find joy in the small moments when they smiled or giggled, their tiny faces lighting up with the innocence of a world they had yet to understand. The shed became a home, filled with the sounds of life, of laughter and soft coos, of the rustle of blankets as the babies learned to crawl, their small hands exploring the rough floor, their eyes wide with wonder at the simplest of things. Raymond watched them, his heart swelling with pride and fear, knowing the world outside would not be kind to them, knowing the challenges they would face simply because of the color of their skin, because of the circumstances of their birth. But as he held them close, rocking them to sleep, singing the lullabies his wife once sang, Raymond promised them and himself that he would protect them, that he would guide them, that he would give them every piece of strength he had left. They were his daughters now, bound not by blood but by the bond of survival, of hope, of the quiet, enduring love that grows in the darkest of places. And so, in that small, broken shed at the edge of the scrapyard, as the world moved on around them, unaware and uncaring, a new family was born from the ashes of abandonment, from the despair of a man who had lost everything, from the cries of two babies who had been left to die in the cold. They became each other's salvation. A promise that no matter how harsh the world would become, they would face it together. As the rain continued to fall outside, washing the dirt from the streets, Raymond looked down at the sleeping faces of Amara and Aoife, the rise and fall of their breaths in perfect unison. And for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to believe that there was still something good left in the world, something worth fighting for, something worth living for. Morning light pushed through the cracks of the shed's boards, casting thin lines across the floor where Amara and Aoife lay, sleeping on the blankets Raymond had carefully arranged for them. The warmth of dawn was gentle in the way it touched their skin, softening the hard lines of the small space they called home, making the peeling paint and rust-stained corners appear, for a moment, like a place of safety rather than survival. Raymond sat nearby, sharpening the small blade he used to cut wires, his eyes lifting to watch the girls each time they moved, each breath a reminder of why he woke before sunrise each day. The girls grew with the quiet resilience that comes from being loved without condition, even in a world that measured worth by things they did not have. Their laughter filled the shed when they learned to walk, stumbling across the rough floor, grabbing at Raymond's hands, their small faces breaking into wide smiles when they fell and tried again. He found himself laughing too, the sound strange and unfamiliar to his own ears, like an old song remembered from a time before the silence. They followed him to the scrapyard, toddling behind him with bright eyes, watching as he sorted through the metal and wires, learning the names of the different pieces, their questions endless, their curiosity a bright flame against the gray backdrop of the world outside. The neighbors whispered, as neighbors do, about the old man with the dark-skinned girls, about their origins and the rumors that clung to them like shadows. They said the girls would bring him nothing but trouble, that they were a curse, reminders of sins unspoken. Raymond heard them but did not let the words touch him. At night, when he lay on the thin mattress between Amara and Afa, their small hands curled around his fingers as they slept, he knew that the world outside could say what it wished. Inside that shed, they were family, bound by something stronger than blood, something unbreakable. School came as the girls grew, a necessary step that filled Raymond with pride and fear in equal measure. He washed their clothes carefully in the cold water he carried from the pump, brushing out stains, mending tears with thread that barely matched, ensuring they would walk into their first day with dignity, even if their shoes were worn and their dresses faded. Amara clung to his leg that morning, her eyes wide, her lips trembling as she looked at the building, so large and unfamiliar, while Afa held her sister's hand tightly, her chin lifted in quiet determination. They learned quickly that the world beyond their small home was not kind. Other children whispered and pointed, their eyes filled with the unspoken knowledge passed down from parents, about color, about poverty, about differences that mattered too much in a town that pretended it did not see them. Amara would return home some days with tears she tried to hide, her small hands clenching the straps of her bag, her eyes refusing to meet Raymond's as he asked about her day. Af, quieter, carried her pain deeper, her drawings on scraps of paper the only place she let her feelings spill, sketches of houses she dreamed of, places where no one looked at them with pity or suspicion. Raymond did what he could to ease their burdens. He spent evenings teaching them the letters they struggled to learn, tracing them in the dirt outside with a stick, praising each success with a smile that reached his tired eyes. He found books in discarded boxes, wiping off the grime, and read to them by lantern light, his voice weaving stories that carried them far beyond the walls of the shed, to places of wonder, to worlds where they were not judged by the color of their skin or the poverty of their clothes. As the seasons passed, the girls grew taller, their limbs growing strong from walking the long roads to school and helping Raymond with small chores. They learned to help sort the wires, to separate the metals, to stack the cans carefully, earning small coins that went into a jar they kept hidden beneath the floorboards, their secret treasure for the future they dreamed of. Amara's love for colors and fabrics grew, her fingers learning the art of folding, of twisting old scraps into small decorations, creating flowers from bits of discarded ribbons, dreaming of clothes she could one day make that would bring beauty into the world. Af, with her quiet focus, drew buildings and shapes in the dirt, using pieces of charcoal, explaining to Raymond how she would design houses with big windows so children could see the stars at night. They did not have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. On the days when there was no food, when the work was scarce and the weather was harsh, they would sit together, wrapped in the old blankets, Raymond telling them stories of their strength, of their courage, reminding them that they were more than what the world saw. They believed him because they had seen how he faced each day, with shoulders squared, never allowing the weight of the world to bend him completely, even when it pressed hard against him. The first time Amara fell ill with fever, Raymond sat by her side, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, praying quietly as her small body shook, her breaths shallow and quick. Ife stayed close, holding her sister's hand, refusing to sleep, her eyes wide with fear that Raymond recognized from his own childhood, the fear of losing the only family that mattered. He managed to find help from a nurse who came by the shed, a woman who had seen him bringing the girls to the clinic and, despite the gossip, saw the love in the way he held them. She brought medicine, taught him how to cool the fever, how to keep Amara hydrated, and stayed until the worst had passed, leaving behind a small smile that softened her tired face. The illness passed, but the worry remained, a reminder that their lives balanced on a fragile edge, that the world could take them from him at any moment. It made Raymond more determined, more careful, more grateful for each morning. He woke to find the girls' faces turned toward him, their sleepy smiles brightening the dark corners of the shed. Years moved slowly, measured in the growth of the girls, in the way their voices changed from the high-pitched songs of children to the steady words of young women who had learned to navigate a world that was not made for them. Amara's hands became deft, learning to repair clothes for neighbors for a few coins, adding stitches that were careful and clean, her pride swelling each time someone thanked her for her work. Ife's drawings filled pages of discarded notebooks, her eyes lighting up each time she shared her designs with Raymond, explaining how she would build houses for people like them, strong and beautiful, safe against the storms. Despite the whispers, despite the challenges, the three of them carved out a life in the shadows, creating moments of light with each small victory. They celebrated birthdays with pieces of bread and laughter, shared meals when there was food, and shared dreams when there was not. They learned to find beauty in the small things, in the way the dawn light looked through the holes in the roof, in the way rain sounded when it fell softly on the metal sheets, in the warmth of sitting close together when the nights were cold. Raymond saw the strength in the girls, the way they refused to let the world define them, the way they lifted each other up, the way they looked at him with love, calling him Papa with voices that made the hardest days worth living. He knew the world would not always be kind, that they would face challenges he could not shield them from, but he also knew that they had within them a light that could not be easily extinguished. As they grew, the promise they had once whispered to each other around the small fire remained, the promise that they would rise above the shadows, that they would change the course of their lives, that they would one day give back to the man who had given them everything he could, even when he had nothing. In the quiet moments, when Raymond sat outside the shed in the early hours before dawn, watching the city wake, he allowed himself to believe that the future would be different for Amara and Ife, that the world would one day see them for the strength and beauty they carried within, not the circumstances of their birth. He saw them already as they would one day be, standing tall, unafraid, their heads held high, walking into a world they would reshape with their dreams and their determination. And so, in the small space of their humble home, under the rusted roof and beside the warmth of the small fire, they continued to grow, to learn, to love, and to hope, building a life in the shadows with the quiet certainty that even there light could find its way, and that even the abandoned could rise to become something more than the world had ever expected. The mornings began earlier now, the air cooler against their skin as Amara and Ife rose before dawn to help Raymond prepare for the day. The shed that had once felt like a prison of rust and dampness had become a space of quiet industry, a small, determined heartbeat in a world that rarely noticed the efforts of those who moved silently within it. They moved carefully around each other, the girls folding the worn blankets and tidying the few possessions they had, while Raymond prepared their breakfast from whatever small supplies they managed to gather from the market, or from neighbors who, despite their whispers, sometimes remembered their own humanity enough to help. The girls had grown tall, their limbs long and strong from the constant walking to and from school, from carrying water, from helping Raymond sort the metals and wires that he still collected to earn what little he could. Their hair was braided neatly each morning, a ritual they performed for each other with gentle hands and quiet laughter, even when the mornings were cold, even when their stomachs rumbled with hunger that had become a companion rather than an enemy. The school uniforms they wore were patched and faded, but they kept them clean, washing them carefully and laying them out to dry on the old lines strung across the side of the shed, watching as the wind lifted them, if only for a moment, into small flags of hope. Amara had begun to work at a small tailor's shop near the market, her fingers quick and careful as she learned to stitch the seams of dresses, to repair the tears in shirts, to measure and cut fabric with an accuracy that impressed the woman who ran the shop. She would return home each evening, her fingers pricked with tiny needle marks, her shoulders sore from bending over the work table, but her eyes bright with the satisfaction of having created something that people wanted, something that made them smile, even if only for a moment. She saved every coin she earned, placing them in the jar beneath the floorboards with the same carefulness she applied to her stitching, each coin a promise to herself and to Aoife, a promise that their dreams would not remain dreams forever. I, meanwhile, had found a place at a small shop that sold building materials, running errands, carrying small loads, sweeping the floor, and watching the builders who came in with plans and sketches, speaking of measurements and designs that fascinated her. She would collect the discarded papers they left behind, pieces of blueprints and notes, taking them home and studying them by lantern light, her fingers tracing the lines, her mind filling with ideas for the homes she wanted to build one day. She would draw late into the night, her face lit by the soft glow of the lantern, the lines on the paper forming walls, roofs, windows that opened to the sky, homes that were warm and filled with light, homes she wished they had when the rain came through the cracks in the shed's roof. Raymond watched them with pride that filled his tired body with warmth, even on the days when his joints ached from the cold, even when the coins he earned were not enough for more than a loaf of bread and a few handfuls of beans. He saw in them the life he had thought lost, the future he had once believed stolen by the cruelty of fate, returned to him in the shape of two young women who refused to bend to the world's expectations. They moved with a quiet confidence, learning to navigate the narrow alleys and crowded streets, learning to speak firmly when they needed to, learning to hold their heads high even when others tried to push them down. The days were long, the work hard, but they found moments of joy within them, moments when Amara would show Aoife a new stitch she had learned, or when Aoife would share a drawing of a house she had designed, explaining where the windows would go, where the kitchen would be, how the roof would catch the rain and guide it to a barrel for collecting water. They would sit together, their heads close, the lantern light reflecting in their eyes, as they spoke of the future, of the plans they were making, of the lives they would build for themselves and for Raymond, who they promised would one day rest his tired hands and sit in the shade of a house that Aoife had built and Amara had decorated with curtains she had sewn. There were days when the weight of their struggles pressed hard against them, Days when customers at the tailor shop would complain about prices and demand more for less, treating Amara as if her time meant nothing. There were days when Ife would return home with bruises on her arms from carrying heavy loads, her fingers stained with dust, her body exhausted from work that was meant for men twice her size. On those days, Raymond would sit with them, his voice steady as he reminded them of their worth, as he told them stories of the people they would become, of the future that was waiting for them if they kept moving forward. The jar beneath the floorboards grew heavier, the coins clinking softly as they added to it each evening, a sound that became a lullaby, a promise whispered to them in the quiet moments before they fell asleep. They would count the coins sometimes, their heads bent together, their fingers moving the small pieces of metal into neat stacks, calculating how much more they needed, how much closer they were to renting a small space in the market where Amara could begin selling the clothes she wanted to make, where Ife could draw her plans and one day find someone who would help her build them. They began to take small steps toward this dream, using the scraps of fabric that Amara brought home to make small accessories, hair ties, and simple cloth bags, which they sold at the market on weekends, sitting together on a small mat they laid out on the dusty ground. The customers were few at first, the coins slow to come, but each sale was a victory. Each smile from a customer a reminder that what they made had value, that they had value. They would return home tired, the dust of the market clinging to their clothes, the sunburn on their necks, warm to the touch, but they would smile as they added the new coins to the jar, as they planned for the next weekend, for the next small step toward the life they were building. The neighbors began to notice, the whispers changing from scorn to curiosity, the eyes that once looked down on them beginning to look at them with a quiet respect, even if unspoken. The girls carried themselves differently now, their backs straighter, their voices stronger, the pride in their work giving them a confidence that the poverty of their circumstances could not erase. Raymond saw it in the way they walked, in the way they spoke to customers, in the way they planned their days with purpose, each task a step toward the future they were determined to claim. Even in the quiet moments of fear, when the weight of the future felt too heavy, when the rain came through the cracks in the roof and soaked their blankets, when the hunger returned with its sharp claws, they held on to the dreams they had shared, reminding each other of the promises they had made, of the future that was waiting for them. Amara would hold Ife's hand, reminding her of the house she would one day build, while Ife would place a hand on Amara's shoulder, reminding her of the clothes she would one day sell to people who would wear them with pride. Raymond, in those moments, would watch them, his heart full, his eyes shining with tears he did not let fall, knowing that they were becoming the women he had always believed they could be, the women the world needed, the women who would change everything. He saw in them the future he had once thought lost, the light that had been given to him on a cold, rainy morning when he found them in the darkness, crying in the trash, waiting for someone to see them, to save them. And so they continued, day after day, step by step, building their dream from the ground up, refusing to be defined by the circumstances of their birth, refusing to let the world tell them who they were meant to be. In the small shed at the edge of the scrapyard, with the wind whispering through the cracks and the city moving beyond them, Amara and Ife took their first steps toward success, toward freedom, toward the lives they were determined to create together as a family, as sisters, as survivors who would one day become more than the world had ever allowed them to imagine. The small mat at the edge of the marketplace had become a familiar sight, the girls' bright smiles and careful displays drawing attention from passers-by who had begun to associate them with the colors of the fabric and the quiet persistence with which they returned week after week. Amara and Ife moved with practiced ease now, setting out their handmade cloth bags and hair ties, arranging them so each piece caught the soft light of morning, the patterns of reds and yellows and deep greens forming small islands of beauty against the dusty ground. The jar beneath the floorboards at home was heavier now, the clink of coins a promise that felt closer each time they added to it, and their dreams, once whispered under the thin blankets at night, had begun to take shape in the early dawns and long days they spent working side by side. They had learned to watch the faces of the customers as they approached, to see the flicker of interest and the softening of expression when a hand reached out to touch the fabric, to test the seams, to admire the small details Amara had worked into each piece. Amara would speak gently, explaining the care taken in each stitch, the reason behind each design, her voice filled with the quiet pride of someone who had found her purpose. Ife would stand beside her, holding a small notebook in which she kept track of each sale, each coin received, each item marked off the list with the careful handwriting she had practiced in the dim light of the lantern each night. Raymond would sometimes watch from a distance, his hands resting on the handle of the cart. He still pushed through the alleys in the early mornings, his eyes following the movements of the girls with a warmth that settled deep in his chest. He saw in them the reflection of everything he had hoped for, everything he had fought to protect on the day he had found them in the rain, their cries piercing the dawn, calling to something inside him that had refused to die even when grief had threatened to drown it. Each time he saw a customer leave with one of Amara's bags or a hair tie carefully tied around a child's braid, he felt the weight of his years lift, replaced by a quiet certainty that the future was being built, piece by piece, with every sale they made. The small successes at the market grew into something larger when a woman who ran a nearby stall approached them one afternoon, her eyes sharp but kind, her hands calloused from years of labor. She had watched them, she said, seen the way customers lingered, the way they returned, asking for more of the small creations that carried the signature of Amara's careful hands. She offered them a corner of her stall, a space beneath the shade of her canopy where their goods would be protected from the harsh sun and sudden rains, a space that came with a promise of more eyes, more customers, more opportunities to grow. Amara and Ife took the offer with gratitude that filled their voices, moving their small collection beneath the canopy, arranging it with the same care, but now with the protection that allowed them to stay through the hottest hours of the day. They learned to manage the flow of customers, to speak with confidence, to handle the coins with the quick, practiced movements of those who understood the value of each small sale, each connection made with the people who stopped to admire their work. They began to receive requests, customers asking for specific colors, for larger bags, for patterns that matched a favorite dress or a child's school uniform. And Amara would take careful notes, spending the evenings at home cutting and stitching, her fingers moving in rhythm with the soft conversations she shared with Ife as they planned for the days ahead. With each passing week, the coins grew in number, the small jar replaced by a larger tin, the soft clinking of the money becoming a sound that filled their small shed with hope each evening. They began to speak more openly of their plans, of the shop they would one day open, of the name they would give to the brand that was slowly being born in the corners of the market and in the hearts of those who came to them for their carefully made goods. Ife would draw designs for the sign they would hang above the door, sketches of a small, bright shop filled with the colors of Amara's creations, with space for her own drawings, for the plans she hoped to turn into homes for people like them, for families who needed a place to feel safe. They decided on a name one evening as the rain fell softly on the roof, the water seeping through the cracks in places, dripping into the small pots they kept to catch it. They named it Grace and Light, for the meanings of their names, for the way they had found each other in the darkness, for the way they had learned to build something beautiful from the pieces of a world that had once tried to break them. Amara wrote the name carefully on a piece of cardboard, practicing the letters, tracing them with a piece of charcoal until they looked just right, holding it up for Raymond to see as he sat on the edge of the bed, a smile breaking across his face as he read the words aloud. The announcement of their brand began simply, with Amara writing the name on the tags she attached to each item, a small piece of paper with Grace and Light written in careful script, tied with a piece of string to each bag and hair tie, a promise of the care and hope that had gone into its creation. Customers began to notice, asking about the name, listening as Amara explained, her voice steady and warm, telling them of the dream they were building, of the future they were claiming with each piece they sold. The community began to take notice, the whispers changing once more, this time to words of admiration, of respect for the young women who had refused to be defined by the place they had come from, who had taken the circumstances of their birth and turned them into something beautiful, something that people wanted to be a part of. A local teacher who had seen the girls walking to school each day approached them, offering to help them set up a small social media page to share their work, taking pictures of the items, helping them post them with the promise of reaching more customers, of growing their small brand into something larger. Amara and Ife learned to navigate the world of online sales, taking careful photos of each item, writing descriptions that told the story of their creation, responding to messages with the same warmth they offered to customers at the market. Orders began to come in slowly, a bag here, a hair tie there, but each sale was a victory, each message of thanks a reminder that what they were doing mattered, that their work was reaching beyond the small corner of the market, into homes they would never see, into the hands of people who believed in the promise of grace and light. At home, the evenings were filled with the soft hum of the sewing machine Amara had managed to buy secondhand, its presence in their shed a symbol of how far they had come, the steady rhythm of its needle a soundtrack to the conversations they shared about the future. Ife would sit nearby, working on her designs, planning the small workshop they would add to their shop, the space where she would one day help families design homes that were safe and welcoming, homes that would not crumble under the rain, homes that would stand strong against the winds, homes that would hold the laughter and warmth she had found with her sister and Raymond. Raymond, now older and more tired, found himself resting more often, his body no longer able to keep up with the long days of pushing the cart, but he found joy in watching the girls work, in seeing the way they moved around each other, the way they spoke with customers, the way they returned each evening with stories of small successes and plans for the next day. They took care of him now, bringing him meals, ensuring he was warm, sharing with him the details of their work, including him in their dreams, reminding him each day that the life he had saved on that rainy morning had become something strong and beautiful, something that was changing not just their own futures, but the lives of those around them. In the quiet moments, as the lantern flickered and the city outside settled into the sounds of the night, Amara and Aoife would sit together, their shoulders touching, their hands busy with the final stitches of the day, the soft sound of the needle moving through the fabric a reminder of how far they had come. They would speak of the next steps, of the savings they were building, of the location they had seen near the market that they hoped to rent, of the sign they would paint together and hang above the door, of the customers who would walk through that door greeted with the warmth they had learned to give, with the promise of grace and light. The future felt close now, no longer a distant hope whispered in the darkness, but a reality being built with each stitch, each sale, each moment they spent working toward the dream they had shared since they were children, lying beneath thin blankets, listening to the rain, promising each other that they would rise, that they would build something that would last, that they would create a life that was their own. And so, with every sunrise, with every day spent beneath the canopy at the market, with every coin added to the growing savings, Amara and Ife continued the birth of their brand, their legacy, their promise to themselves and to Raymond, building a future with steady hands and hearts that refused to yield, carrying with them the grace of survival and the light of hope into a world that was finally beginning to see them for who they truly were. The rhythm of their days had settled into a quiet certainty, each dawn bringing the comforting clatter of the sewing machine and the rustle of fabric as Amara and Ife prepared the items for the stall, each evening closing with the soft glow of the lantern as they counted the coins that were no longer just small pieces of metal, but steps toward the life they were building. Grace and light had become known in the market, a small brand whispered about in customers who admired the quality and warmth of their creators, by neighbors who now spoke of the girls with pride rather than pity, by other sellers who had watched them arrive in the early hours, setting up their space with careful hands and determined smiles. The shop was no longer just a distant dream but a reality waiting on the horizon, the savings tucked away in careful piles, the space near the market already chosen, its cracked walls and dusty windows seen not as flaws but as the bones of something beautiful waiting to be created. They had begun to plan the colors they would paint. The curtains Amara would sew for the small windows, the counter Ife would design, sturdy and welcoming, where customers would lean to speak with them, where they would sign receipts and share the stories of each piece they sold. Raymond listened to their plans with a quiet joy, nodding as they described where they would hang the sign with grace and light written in bold, hopeful letters, where they would place the table for Ife's sketches, how they would save a small corner for a chair where he could sit and watch them work, a place of honor for the man who had given them the chance to dream. It was during these days of promise that the past returned, not as a whisper in the wind, but as a presence that stepped into the warmth of their growing light, reminding them of the shadows they had once come from. It was a morning like any other, the sun rising gently, the marketplace beginning to stir with the sounds of voices calling to each other, of carts rolling over the stones, of the soft chatter of women preparing their stalls. Amara and Ife were setting out their goods, arranging the bags and accessories with the practiced care that had become part of their morning ritual, their conversation light with laughter as they spoke of the customers they hoped would come that day. The woman appeared at the edge of the market, her clothes worn and her steps uncertain, her eyes scanning the stalls as if searching for something she could not name. Her hair was streaked with gray, her skin marked with lines of hardship, her hands clutching a small empty basket as she moved from stall to stall, asking in a voice that was both pleading and tired if there was any work, any small task she could do for a few coins or for a piece of bread. Some sellers turned her away with a shake of their heads, others ignored her entirely, their eyes sliding past her as if she were nothing more than a shadow moving through the bright morning. When she reached the corner where Grace and Light stood, her eyes lifted, and for a moment she froze. her gaze falling on the girls who stood before her, their hands busy with their work, their voices warm as they spoke to a customer. Something in her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, of memory that darted across her face before it settled into the weary mask she wore. She stepped forward, her voice trembling as she asked if there was anything she could do to help, if they needed someone to sweep the space or carry something, her words tumbling over each other in a rush that spoke of desperation, of hunger that was deeper than the emptiness in her stomach. Amara and Ifa looked at each other, their eyes meeting in silent conversation, the kindness they had learned from Raymond guiding them as they nodded, offering her a small task of sweeping the dust from around their stall, giving her a few coins and a piece of bread from the small basket of food they kept hidden beneath the table for their lunch. She accepted with tears in her eyes, her hands shaking as she took the bread, her eyes lingering on them with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper, something that made her turn away quickly, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. Over the days that followed, she returned, each morning arriving to offer her help, sweeping the space, carrying small bundles for them, watching them with a quiet attentiveness that Amara and Ife could not understand but did not question. They learned her name was Hannah, that she had come back to the town after many years away, that she had no family left, no home to return to, that she survived by doing small tasks for the sellers in the market, by accepting whatever food or coins they could spare, by sleeping in a corner of an abandoned building where the cold crept in each night and the fear of the darkness was kept at bay only by the exhaustion that came with hunger. Raymond noticed her, too, his eyes narrowing as he watched her move around the stall, the way her gaze lingered on the girls, the way her hands sometimes lifted toward them before falling back to her sides, the way she seemed to flinch when they spoke kindly to her, as if kindness were something she could not bear. He said nothing, but in the quiet of the evenings he watched Amara and Ife as they spoke of Hannah, as they shared their concern for the woman who had become a shadow in their days, a presence that they felt but could not understand. It was one of the older sellers, a woman who had lived in the town for many years, who spoke the words that cracked open the door to the past they had never known. She told them of a young woman who had once lived in the town, who had brought shame to her family by giving birth to two dark-skinned babies, who had disappeared one night, leaving behind whispers of disgrace, of sin, of abandonment that had never been spoken of openly but had lived in the corners of conversations, in the glances exchanged between neighbors, in the stories told in hushed voices to warn others of what happens when shame becomes too heavy to bear. The words fell into the quiet of the evening as Amara and Ife sat together, their hands stilling in their work, the soft sound of the sewing machine falling silent as the weight of the revelation settled around them. They looked at each other, seeing in each other the reflection of the questions they had never dared to speak, the questions of where they had come from, of who had left them, of why they had been found in the darkness of that morning so many years ago. They turned to Raymond, their eyes searching his face, their voices quiet as they asked him if he knew, if he had always known, if the woman who swept their stall, who took their bread with shaking hands, who looked at them with eyes filled with something unspoken, was the shadow of the mother they had never known. Raymond sat in the silence, his hands folded, his eyes closed as he breathed deeply, the memories of that morning flooding back, the rain, the cries, the weight of the babies in his arms, the promise he had made to them, to himself, to the memory of the family he had lost. He opened his eyes, meeting their gaze, his voice steady as he told them the truth of how he had found them, of how he had taken them in, of how he had chosen to love them as his own, of how he had believed that the past did not matter as long as they had a future together. The truth was a wound that opened, but it was also a light that filled the room, illuminating the path they had walked, the strength they had found, the love that had been given to them not by the circumstances of their birth but by the made in the moments that followed. They sat together, the three of them, the silence deep but not empty, the weight of the truth settling not as a burden, but as a part of the story they carried, a part of the journey that had brought them to this place of hope, of building, of becoming. The next morning, Amara and Afe returned to the market, their hands steady as they set out their goods, their eyes lifting to find Hannah standing at the edge of their stall, her eyes filled with fear, with hope, with the silent plea of someone who has lived too long in the shadows of her own choices. They saw her, truly saw her, and in that moment they understood the fullness of who they were, the grace of the life they had been given, the light they had become, the power of the forgiveness they would have to choose, for themselves, for her, for the story that was still being written, stitch by careful stitch, day by determined day. Morning arrived with a pale hush, the light pressing gently through the cracked window of their small room, the sounds of the market waking slowly outside, familiar and comforting even as the weight of the day settled over them. Amara and Ife sat together on the edge of their bed, their hands resting in their laps, their shoulders touching as they watched the lantern flicker and fade with the rising dawn. The night had been restless, filled with dreams that were not dreams, memories that were not memories, shadows moving through their minds as they tried to understand what it meant to know the truth, to carry it, to let it breathe in the spaces between them. Raymond moved quietly around the room, preparing the small pot of tea they shared each morning. His movements slower now, each step careful but steady. His eyes lifted to them, soft and full of the quiet pride he never spoke aloud, the pride that lived in the way he watched them, in the way he listened when they spoke, in the way he had always made them feel safe even when the world outside tried to make them feel small. He did not speak as he set the cups before them, the steam rising in small spirals, the warmth of it a promise that the day would begin as it always had, with them together, with them choosing to step into the world once more. They walked to the market side by side, the weight of the truth they now carried not heavy but present, a quiet thread that wove itself into the fabric of who they were, of who they would continue to be. The streets were alive with the sounds of morning, the laughter of children running with bare feet over the dusty ground, the calls of sellers arranging their goods, the low hum of conversation that rose and fell like a comforting tide. Amara's hands were steady as she arranged the bags and accessories on the table, her fingers smoothing the fabric, aligning each piece with the care that had become her signature, the small gestures that spoke of the pride she took in her work. Af stood beside her, checking the lists in her notebook, the neat lines of her handwriting a map of their journey, each item recorded, each sale noted, each small success a step toward the life they had promised themselves they would build. Hannah arrived as she had each morning, her steps hesitant, her eyes lifting to them with a mixture of hope and fear, her hands clutching the edge of her worn shawl as she waited for them to acknowledge her presence. There was a moment of silence, the space between them filled with the weight of the past, with the unspoken words that hovered in the air, with the truth that had found its way into the light. Amara looked at Ife, their eyes meeting in a quiet conversation. Then they turned to Hannah, their faces calm, their eyes steady as they nodded, inviting her to step closer, to take her place beside them as she swept the dust from around the stall, as she lifted her eyes to them with tears she did not try to hide. The day passed with the steady rhythm they had come to love. Customers arriving to admire the goods, to speak with them, to share stories and laughter that made the hours pass in the warmth of human connection. Hannah worked quietly, her movements careful, her eyes watching them with a tenderness that was tinged with sorrow, with regret that lived in the lines of her face, with a longing that trembled in her hands when she reached out to pass them a piece of cloth or to straighten a bag that had shifted in the breeze. There were moments when she would pause, her eyes closing for a breath, as if holding back words she did not know how to speak, as if trying to find the courage to face the daughters she had once left behind. It was Raymond who broke the silence that evening, his voice gentle as he invited Hannah to sit with them, offering her a cup of tea, the warmth of it held carefully in her trembling hands as she lowered herself onto the small stool they brought for her. The market was quiet now, the sun setting in a wash of colors that filled the sky with the promise of another night, another day to come. They sat together, the four of them, the light of the lantern flickering between them, the silence deep but not empty, filled with the sounds of the world settling, with the quiet beating of hearts that had learned to endure. Hannah's voice was soft when she finally spoke, breaking the stillness with words that came in fragments, with pauses that were filled with tears that fell silently onto her hands. She told them of her fear, of the shame that had driven her to leave, of the way she had believed the whispers that had told her she was nothing, that her children would be nothing, that the only way to save herself was to run, to let them go, to leave them behind in the darkness of that cold morning. She spoke of the years that had followed, years filled with emptiness, with hunger, with the weight of her choices pressing down on her until she could no longer breathe, with the moments when she thought of them, of the babies she had left, wondering if they had survived, if they had found someone to love them, if they had learned to smile, to walk, to speak. Amara and Ife listened, their hands resting together, their eyes watching the woman who had given them life, but had not given them the beginning they had needed, the woman who had left them but who now sat before them, stripped of all pretenses, of all the masks she had worn to survive the years that had followed her choices. They felt the weight of her words, the pain of her regrets, the sorrow that trembled in her voice, the hope that lived in her eyes, the hope that perhaps forgiveness was possible, that perhaps there was a way to heal the wounds that had been left open for so long. The silence that followed was long, the sounds of the night rising around them, the distant calls of voices in the street, the soft rustle of the wind moving through the market, the quiet hum of the lantern as it burned low. Amara's voice was steady when she spoke, her words clear, her eyes bright with the light that had carried her through every moment of darkness she had faced. She spoke of the life they had built, of the strength they had found, of the love they had shared with Raymond, of the hope they had carried even when they did not know where it had come from, of the dreams they had turned into reality with their own hands, with their own hearts. She told Hannah that they could not change the past, that the pain of what had happened would always be a part of them, but that it did not have to define them, that it did not have to define her. She told her that they had chosen to live in the light, to build a life that was theirs, to forgive themselves for the pain they had carried, and that if Hannah was willing, they could choose to forgive her too, not because it erased what had happened, but because it was the only way to free themselves from the weight of it, to step fully into the future they had worked so hard to claim. Ife's hand tightened around Amara's as she spoke, her own voice joining her sister's, steady and sure, telling Hannah that forgiveness was not a gift given lightly, but a choice made for themselves, a choice to let go of the anger, of the questions that would never have answers, of the shadows that tried to follow them even now. She told her that they would choose to forgive her, that they would choose to move forward, that they would choose to let the past be the past, so that they could all find a way to live in the present, in the light they had built together. Hannah wept then, the tears falling freely, her body shaking with the weight of the forgiveness she had not dared to hope for, the forgiveness that was given not because she deserved it, but because they chose to give it, because they chose to live in the freedom it offered them all. Raymond reached out, his hand resting on hers, his eyes filled with the quiet strength of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen to believe in the best of it. A man who had given his life to the promise of hope, to the promise of the light that could be found even in the darkest of places. They sat together as the lantern burned low, as the night settled fully around them, as the sounds of the world grew quiet, holding the moment between them, letting it settle into the spaces that had once been filled with pain, with questions, with the heavy silence of what had been left unsaid. They let it settle, and then they let it go, choosing to rise together to carry forward not the weight of the past, but the promise of the future, of the life they would continue to build, of the grace they would continue to give, of the light they would continue to share. In the days that followed, Hannah began to work with them, her hands learning the careful stitches that Amara taught her, her eyes following the lines of the designs that life sketched, her heart slowly finding its place in the small family that had chosen to welcome her, to give her a place not because she had earned it, but because they had chosen to love, to forgive, to move forward. Raymond watched them with a quiet joy, his days filled with the laughter of the girls he had raised, with the warmth of the woman who had given them life, and now found her own life renewed in their forgiveness. The shop they opened near the market became a place of light, a place where customers came not just to buy the goods they created, but to share in the warmth of the space they had built, to witness the quiet strength of a family that had learned to forgive, to heal, to grow. The sign that hung above the door, painted in bright colors that caught the light each morning, read Grace and Light, a promise that was kept with each day they opened the door, with each piece they sold, with each smile they shared. Amara and Ife continued to build their dreams, to live in the fullness of the life they had created, their hands steady, their hearts strong, their spirits unyielding in the face of the challenges that came. They held the past with compassion, honoring it without allowing it to define them, choosing each day to step forward in the light, in the grace they had found in each other, in the family they had chosen, in the future they continued to build, together, unafraid, free. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other stories for more real-life journeys like this. And if this touched you, share this video with someone who needs to see it today.